Something is quietly building across the global financial system that most people are not paying attention to. As of late 2025, 9 countries are actively in debt distress, and 24 more are at high risk. To understand how that happens, and why it keeps happening, you need to understand how sovereign debt crises actually unfold. Start with why countries borrow in the first place. Governments issue bonds to fund spending that exceeds their tax revenue. In good times, this is manageable. Debt grows, but so does the economy. The critical variable, however, is what currency that debt is denominated in. A country borrowing in its own currency retains some control. It can, in extreme, print its way out. But most developing nations must borrow in dollars, and if their currency weakens, the cost of that debt explodes overnight without a single new dollar being borrowed. Economists call this the original sin of sovereign debt, and it sits at the center of almost every crisis. The sequence that follows is remarkably consistent. It begins with a build-up, cheap global credit, a commodity boom, and politicians who overpromise and underestimate risk. Debt accumulates but feels manageable. Then comes an external shock. Commodity prices collapse, global interest rates rise, or a recession hits. Revenue falls while debt payments stay fixed. At that point, bond investors start demanding higher yields to compensate for the growing risk, which makes the debt harder to service, which pushes yields higher still. Capital flees, the currency weakens, and the fear of default begins making default more likely. The spiral is self-reinforcing. Eventually, the IMF arrives as lender of last resort, offering emergency financing in exchange for austerity measures and structural reforms. If the math still does not work, the country enters restructuring, negotiating with creditors to reduce what it owes. Creditors take losses, the country gets breathing room, and the cycle resets. No country illustrates this cycle more clearly than Argentina, which has defaulted 9 times since independence and owes more to the IMF than any other country on Earth, approximately $41 billion. In April 2025, the IMF approved a new $20 billion loan for Argentina. It was the country's 23rd IMF program since 1958. 23 programs is not a rescue. It is a recurring relationship. The 2001 crisis remains the defining moment. Argentina had pegged its peso 1-to-1 with the US dollar to kill hyperinflation, a strategy that worked until it made exports uncompetitive, the economy contracted, and dollar debt became unpayable. The government froze bank accounts in an event known as the Corralito. Citizens could not access their own money. The country defaulted on $100 billion, the largest sovereign default in history at the time. 5 presidents came and went in 2 weeks. That history provides the context for what is happening in Argentina today. Inflation surpassed 160% in early 2024. And roughly 40% of Argentines were living in poverty. New President Javier Milei, who campaigned literally carrying a chainsaw as a symbol of fiscal cuts, achieved the country's first budget surplus in 16 years. Inflation fell sharply. Markets responded positively, but social spending dropped 17%, and 52,000 civil service jobs were eliminated. A $42 billion support package arrived from an unlikely coalition of the IMF, China, the World Bank, and the IDB, reflecting how thoroughly geopolitics and sovereign debt have become intertwined. Analysts still debate whether restructuring is ultimately inevitable regardless. Argentina is instructive precisely because it is extreme, but the underlying dynamics, debt accumulation, external shocks, confidence spirals, IMF intervention, are playing out across dozens of countries simultaneously. Developing nations are projected to pay a record $400 billion in external debt service, money that cannot simultaneously fund healthcare or infrastructure. And a new complication has emerged. China is now one of the largest creditors to developing nations, but operates outside the traditional restructuring frameworks. When Zambia needed to restructure, coordinating between Western creditors, the IMF, and Beijing took 3 years. The sovereign debt system has no bankruptcy court and no clean resolution process. A country that defaults suffers, but it survives because it keeps existing. The real question in every crisis is always the same. Who bears the pain? The citizens through austerity, the bondholders through losses, or both? Argentina has been answering that question for 2 centuries. With $100 trillion in global debt still accumulating, many more countries are beginning to ask it too. If you found this analysis useful, subscribe for continued coverage of global finance and macroeconomics. Informed questions and perspectives are welcome in the comments.